The federal election campaign will run this year with the background of floods battering the east coast of Australia. With houses and buildings ravaged, residents had to remain in temporary accommodation a month after the disaster. It's just the latest reminder that Australia is still under threat of climate change. Amelia House, a senior policy analyst at Principles for Responsible Investment, supports investors to achieve their responsible investment practices through policy support in an Australian setting. Ms. House says there's a consistent theme between countries taking strong action on climate. These policies are supported by a comprehensive science-based net zero strategy for the whole economy. These strategies target sectors like transport, energy, forestry, agriculture, and industry. The sustainability advocate also explains how policies implemented overseas could be successful in Australia.
So in the UK, for example, there's been the implementation of a green finance strategy, and that looks at how we can ensure financial flows are aligned with the UK's net zero commitments and also their broader environmental objectives. While the EU Commission has also introduced a suite of sustainable finance policies for investors, but corporations as well, and these are designed to achieve its own climate objectives. And so in particular, those policies look at having a climate sustainability reporting directive aimed at large companies, as well as a sustainable finance disclosure regulation for investors, and an EU sustainable finance taxonomy, which categorizes what economic activities are considered green or climate aligned. Now, I think the lessons we can draw from the EU and the UK here in Australia is that in order to achieve the Paris Agreement, Australia should really consider introducing sustainable finance policies.
According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report released last August, global average temperatures are expected to climb by 1.5 degrees Celsius in 2040, with greenhouse gas emissions and human activity as the lead primary causes. The climate report warned that the timeframe is crucial if the world stays below the Paris Agreement's goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Dramatic action by 2030 is also vital to reaching net zero emissions by 2050 or earlier.
Now, Australia does have a 2050 target, and that is really welcome, but that target needs to be supported by a plan that's aligned with science. And that cannot rely on continued use of fossil fuels beyond 2050. We also need to have more ambitious 2030 economy-wide emissions targets, and that needs to look at least a 50% emissions reduction by 2030 against the 2005 baseline. So an increase from the nationally determined contributions that have already been set. Australia in 2050 set out a nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement, which was to reduce its emissions by 26 to 28% by 2030 against its 2005 baseline. And when that target was set, there was a lot of discussion around how it was considered incredibly insufficient by the scientific evidence. And when we went to the Glasgow COP, there was an opportunity for Australia to update those targets and those contributions in line with other countries also increasing their ambition. But unfortunately, Australia decided to remain with its already inadequately woeful target. Now, according to climate action trackers, these targets would actually put us on track to reach 3 degrees of warming, which is well above Australia's commitment to pursue efforts to limit temperatures to 1.5 degrees under the Paris Agreement. And various reports and rankings last year actually showed that Australia is one of the worst performing countries out of all developed countries when it comes to slashing greenhouse gas emissions.
Australia is not on track to meet its expectations set out by the Paris International Agreement.
Particularly over the past few months following the Russian-Ukraine conflict, there's been a real focus and a real discussion on energy security and decarbonisation. And I think what this conversation, is unfortunately telling us, given the gravity of this conflict, is that we really need to rethink our reliance on fossil fuels and transform our transport industry, for example. So that needs to include policies that phase out internal combustion engine vehicles and increase electric vehicle infrastructure, but also having a look at a comprehensive heavy road transport decarbonisation strategy. I think, secondly, there's going to be a continued conversation around zero carbon power, which has been ongoing for quite a few years. And I think we're now turning into a conversation around how we actually retire current coal capacity and phase down gas fired power generation. But also, when we're having these conversations, we need to be talking about how we can utilize the unique opportunity that's afforded to Australia by taking advantage of the endless sunshine and powerful wind that we have to supercharge new renewable energy capacity here.
Yet, the discourse around significant climate policy action has mainly been absent from this election campaign. Climate Analytics analyzed the global warming implications of the 2030 climate targets of the political parties and independents. The study found alarming data showing the Liberal National Party's targets are consistent with a very dangerous 3 degrees Celsius of global warming. The Australian Labor Party's targets, on the other hand, is slightly better, receding to 2 degrees Celsius. And the Teal Independents and Greens are consistent with keeping global warming at or below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Based on 2005 levels, the Morrison government aims to reduce emissions by 26 to 28% by 2030. Climate Analytics reveals that if all national governments took identical steps, global warming would reach 3 degrees Celsius, possibly even 4 degrees Celsius. All tropical reefs would then be completely destroyed, and extreme heat waves occurring every 10 years would happen almost every other year. Last year, the Liberals refused to increase its 2030 commitments at the United Nations Climate Conference in Glasgow, but the final agreement reached at the summit, which Australia signed, requires governments to strengthen their 2030 targets to match the 1.5 degrees Celsius by November this year. Labor's target of a 43% emissions cut by 2030 from 2005 levels is in line with 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. That means it's not consistent with the Paris Agreement. Under 2 degrees Celsius of warming, extreme heat events that currently happen once a decade could occur about every 3 to 4 years. And they would reach maximum temperatures about 1.7 degrees hotter than heat waves in recent decades. Should Earth overshoot 1.5 degrees Celsius warming and perhaps reach 2 degrees Celsius, some suggest this may be temporary and temperatures could be brought back down. This would require technologies that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but such technologies are uncertain and comes with risks. Of all the climate policies on the table this election, the Greens' target of a 74% cut by 2030 based on 2005 levels is most comfortably consistent with keeping warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. That level of warming would still cause damage to Earth's natural system and way of life. Under 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming, the most extreme heat events that presently occur once a decade could be limited to about every 5 to 6 years. As we move into the next phase of our political cycle, Ms. House believes the discourse on climate policy should consist of 4 compensations that are emerging.
International investors are fully engaging in the discussion on what a global carbon price could look like and should look like. And in Australia, at a more localised perspective, I think there's going to be a conversation around increasing the ambition of our existing safeguard mechanisms by setting baselines for that scheme. And finally, I think what's really exciting and what's really developing is a conversation around sustainable finance and how that is to support the Paris Agreement and what that could look like in Australia. And I think as a first step, that conversation is going to look at how we can ensure Australian investors are actively pursuing real world emissions reductions in their investments, stewardship and public policy engagement.
Unless policies are substantially strengthened, Earth is set to hit 1.5 degrees Celsius warming in the 2030s, and a future of at least 3 degrees Celsius warming awaits. The onus is on the next Parliament to protect Australians from climate catastrophe. On May 21st, Australian voters have a chance to send a clear message about the kind of world we want to leave for future generations. Drishtee, Lokee reporting for News APLENTY.